Hi, in this video I'm going to show the changes in version 1.17. First I would like to thank you Alex for his donation. Thank you very much, it's appreciated. This video will be split in 4 parts. In the first part I'm going to show how to update all flight plans, as version 1.17 will update all flight plans. In the second part I will show the new import format to import the new flight plan format developed by Alpha India Group. The third part I will show how to add your own user aircraft. And in the fourth part I will show some of the minor things that have been updated. If you're running a version earlier than 1.16, you must first update to version 1.16 and update all your flight plans, as I will show in the first part of this video. That's because version 1.16 is a mandatory version. You have to install it and you have to run it to make sure your flight plans will be updated to a format that version 1.17 can read. Likewise, this version 1.17 is also a mandatory version. So when you're later going to update to a future version, for example 1.18, if you have not done so already, you must install and run version 1.17, which will update the file format. The reason for this is I'm going to drop some of the backward compatibility in the software. On the forum I made a post that explains why I'm making these two versions mandatory, and also it give a short description of how to do it. But as I said before, in part 1 of this video I'll show how to do it. As I said in the intro, version 1.17 will update all your flight plans. So once you start the Flightplan Visualizer, it will show some warnings. And also you will note it starts a lot slower, and that's because it loads all flight plans in your active flight plan folders, and then it will resave them to ensure the file format is the new one from version 1.17 and forward. It opened the window outside my recording area. So dragging in this window, it will show you a lot of warnings. And for all flight plans, it will simply say that the file format was updated. And this only happens the first time you start the software. Now these flight plans are updated, so next time you will not see this warning and it will start normal speed. It will not be slower. But in case you have multiple folders for your flight plans, you have to make sure they're all updated. In this case, when I go to enable disable flight plans, you see I have many folders, and actually this time it's only this one, commercial 1.16, that is active. It means it's only the flight plans in this folder that have been updated. So you have to enable each of your folders. If you're 100% sure that the same named flight plan does not exist in multiple of your subfolders, you can enable all of them. But the best way to do it is only enabling one folder at a time. And right now it's only this commercial 1.16 that is enabled, so it's only these flight plans that have been updated. So what I do next is I disable 1.16, then I go to this BizJet 1.16 and enable that. And once I click close, it will start to read all those flight plans. And they have not yet been updated, so again it will take a little longer because it's going to update these files. And again we will see that it displays this warning and saying that these have been updated. If I go back and disable this BizJet, oh, that's the wrong one, this one, and I re-enable this commercial 1.16 instead, You see it will simply load the flight plans. I will not get any warnings. And that's because now they are all updated to the new formats. So this is the procedure you should do both for version 1.16 and version 1.17. If you are still not on version 16, you have to install it and run it as I showed here. Also, if you are on version 16 and you have not yet done as I showed here, enabling one folder at a time, you should do that prior to installing version 1.17. If you don't do it, worst cases, you will have some Flightplan files you can no longer import. And perhaps you'll have to install 1.16 again and perform this task in order to update them. So it's a fairly easy procedure to perform, but you have to do it. In future versions, once you have installed version 1.17, if I later in the process make a mandatory version, you will get a notification. When you do the check for updates, it will actually have an extra section between remarks and what's new in this version. There will be a listing of mandatory versions, all the mandatory versions that lie between the version you currently run and the one that is the latest. It will show you information about those and give you a link to download those mandatory versions first. But it will not work until you have updated to this version 1.17. Up until now, Flightplan Visualizer have only been able to import the AIGFP-file format or the traffic tools format. Alpha India Group have developed a new file format that they're using with the one-click installer. And in this version of Flightplan Visualizer, it now has support for that file format. Both the old flight plans and the new flight plans come in form of zip files. But now in this version, when you double click such a file, it will first analyze that file to figure out if it's the old format or the new format. And based on what it analyzes, it will pick the correct importer and import that file. Importing such a file, you will not see much difference. It's done the same way. You go to import. And for example, I can pick we can pick this one, aviation charters. We get some warnings, and this has nothing to do with the new format. It's simply because it cannot find this airport, and it lists some nearby airports and suggests to use those instead. The old version would also do that. And here we have imported the file format. You will see it just like all other flight plans. You will see the aircraft, the airports, the routes, the legs, and so on. Alpha India Group, they use this 3-letter ICAO code for business jet airlines without a specific airline code, or ICAO code. What I do instead is I would create this as a user airline. So we first take a copy of the name. We press user airlines. We press add. What I do is I'm using a scheme that using the 3 dashes was actually suggested to me by Bruce Nicholson. I further expanded this idea by then suggesting use the IATA code to show which kind of traffic it is. For example, you can use BZ for BizJet or whatever you want. The name of the airline. They don't have a call sign. I guess these are United States. And I set the load factor. If I knew when the company commenced, I could put a date, but I just press save. And now that user airline is added, and I click save, and when I return here, it will see that I had made a new user airline and then ask if I want to use it. I say yes. Next, it asks if I want to set the carrier and the operator also to this new airline, and I say yes. And going back to the aircraft, they now are listed with this user. And I click save, just like any normal flight plan, and it's imported and it's saved. One difference between the new and the old flight plan format is when you edit this flight plan, you no longer have a button down here to export it again. And that's because for the old flight plan format, I imported a lot of data that have to do with the texture in use for these aircraft. For the new format, I decided not to implement that feature because Flightplan Visualizer is not using those data for anything. The old format import them even though they are not used, and that's what allowed them to be exported again. But for the new format, I decided not to do it. So as you saw here, there's nothing special you have to do importing the new format. Every time you install an updated version of Flightplan Visualizer, beside the program files and the updated flight plan files, you also get a set of data files that in most cases is also updated for each version. One of these data files contain a database of aircraft types. Up until now, you have only been able to pick one of these aircraft types when you import a flight plan. It will also automatically detect the aircraft type, but if you wanted to, you could change it to another type. New in this version is you can now create your own user aircraft. So in case there is an aircraft type that you need for a flight plan that is not in the database I supply, you can add it yourself. I would like you to notify me about this so I can add these to the database I supply with the software. But at least now you don't have to wait for the next version. You can simply go add the aircraft yourself. When you add these aircraft, they come in two different versions. You can add what I call an owned aircraft, or you can add an aircraft type. The aircraft type you add will work just like the ones I supply with the software. But the owned aircraft is a specific aircraft, and the reason I call it an owned aircraft is it's an aircraft you own and can fly in your simulator. For example, an Airbus A320 is just an aircraft type, whereas the Aerosoft A320 is a specific owned aircraft. In the same way, PMDG 777, for example, is a specific aircraft, and it's an owned aircraft. It's an aircraft you can own. To add an aircraft, you simply go to the MISC menu, and here you have this new menu item called User Aircraft. This form is split into two tab views, where the first show the owned aircraft and the second show the aircraft types. You don't have to add owned aircraft or aircraft types. It's only for those who need it. The aircraft types you will add if you import a flight plan, and in that flight plan is utilizing an aircraft type that is not included in the aircraft database that I supply with the software. For example, this Gulfstream is G700. It's not in the database I supply with the software. And the reason I have not added it is because I don't know if it have an official IATA or ICAO code. But now I can add it as a user aircraft type. It only exists on my system. Likewise, if I go to the owned aircraft, you'll see all the aircraft I have added here. The way I have named them is I list first in the name I write which version of Flight Simulator they're for. Then I write the company who made it, and then I write the aircraft. And last I write which kind of aircraft. For example, this is a general aviation. This is a passenger aircraft. this one is a freighter, and actually it's not a freighter because I don't have a 330 freighter, but some people have made freighter paints for the Aerosoft 330. You see here, if I go to my Boeings, I will both have passengers and freighters. These are the quality wings, and the PMDG or the Majestic 400 and so on. And to create an owned aircraft, you have to pick a type. It have to be based on an aircraft type, and it doesn't matter if that aircraft type is one that I have supplied with the program, or it's an aircraft type you have created yourself. So when you choose to add an owned aircraft, the first thing it will ask you about is which aircraft type do you want to base it on. For example, I can say 737 and choose, for example, the Dash 700 passenger version. And you can see that it from that type, it have the name, the type name, and it have the IATA code and the CAO code. It's not something you can enter. It's locked because it's based on that type. However, you are able to enter the name yourself. And as I just showed, the way I name them is, I say P3D version 4. I have still not updated to version 5. And I would say it's a PMDG, and then a Boeing 737-700 passenger. And if you look at those I have added here, you see I have even split them into more. This is the one without winglets, and these are the two different kinds of winglets. And the only reason I have chosen to split the same type, for example, the 700 in multiple versions, is simply because that's the way PMDG handles it when you install the repaints, the libraries for these aircraft. And I would like to handle it the same way, so I made multiple versions. But of course, you do it as you please. When you look at the screen, you'll see a lot of fields. I showed this screenshot when I made this version to a user, and we talked a little about it, and he said it looked like a flight planner, because there's a lot of information that you will typically use in a flight planner. I don't intend to make Flightplan Visualizer into a flight planner. However, at a later point, I would like to implement a load sheet where, based on the information about this aircraft, I would suggest a loadout of passengers and fuel and cargo. And in order to do that, I will need a lot of information. For example, I would use these information about the weight of the aircraft. I would use information about the load values. And in order to do the fuel calculation, I would need to know something about the fuel burn. This fuel burn calculation is very simple, and if you have a more detailed fuel planner yourself, I suggest you use that. But at least it helps suggesting that loadout. If we go from the top, as we saw before, the IATA code, the CAO code, and the type name are locked. They are based on the type. You can open this one and pick another type instead. And if you do so, a window will appear, and it will ask, what do you want to update? Do we want to update the usage we have over here? Do we want to update the engine data? Do we want to update the weight data, and so on? And if you click OK, it would update the type, the IATA code, and the CAO code, plus these things you picked. In this case, as long as this is a specific aircraft, it's an owned aircraft, you could choose to enter the registration number for this specific aircraft. You have some information about when it was produced and if it's still in active production. You have the aircraft type, if it's a passenger or freight or whatever. You have information about the engines. In this case, it has two jet engines. For many of the aircraft, I have registered multiple variants of the engine, and you can pick one of those, or you can simply type something in yourself if you need that information. Here below, you can enter all the structural limits of the aircraft. You can enter the empty operating weights. That's the weight of an aircraft without cargo and passenger, but it includes the weight of the flight crew and all other liquids than fuel, what you need in hydraulics and in oil and water and so on. So it's basically an aircraft ready to fly, just needing the payload of passengers and cargo and the fuel. Then you have the maximum weights, the maximum takeoff weights. You have the maximum landing weight. You have the max zero fuel weight. That's the highest allowed weight of the aircraft with all its payload, but except the fuel. Here you have the maximum payload, and I define payload only as the passenger and the cargo. I don't include the fuel in that value. And the fuel, the maximum allowed or the maximum fuel capacity is listed here. For each of these three, you see a shortcut of the name here behind it. These first four are official shortcuts, and these two are my own inventions. You have to enter empty operating weights and maximum takeoff weight. The last four can be omitted, and if you omit them, the program can estimate them. It will never be an accurate value. And the way it estimates these values is it look at the aircraft that I supply in my data files, and it finds the best 10 to 20 matching aircraft to this one. And we will later see how it matches these aircraft. But based on those, it would look statistical on those 10 to 20 aircraft and try to estimate the value. For example, you can see here the max landing weight I have entered for this Boeing is 229,000 pounds. And I can choose to see I want to estimate this value, and when I click here, it will try to estimate it. So you see, it's not the same value, but it's not that far away. The estimating the max landing weight is the best of these four estimation types. And if you don't have the data, if you cannot find the data, I would say it's better to estimate them than have zero values. Again, I suggest you try to look up the correct values either from the internet, or if it's an owned aircraft, perhaps the documentation for this aircraft lists these values, and I would then suggest you enter those. These data in the climbing phase and the descent phase are not used at all at this time. But basically you can enter the average speed of the aircraft in the climb phase, the vertical speeds when climbing, the fuel burn when climbing, and again when you descend, the same values. The cruise phase is fairly important to enter because it's used for the load sheet to calculate the estimated required fuel. You enter the speeds at cruising altitudes. You can enter a maximum the first one is the cruise altitude, and the last one is the maximum altitude. The first could be 39,000 feet, and the last one 41,000 feet. Also, you can enter a fuel burn, and again, that value you can either look up or calculate yourself is better than this estimated one. If I take a copy and I try to estimate it, you see it's not that far away, but again, having the correct value is better. If we continue, the next section you have the maximum passenger count. And this is based on an aircraft type that was listed with 128 passenger seats. But this specific implementation by PMDG, you should look up the documentation and see what is the actual seat count for that aircraft. And that's based on how is the aircraft split in first class or business passenger section, and how far away are the seats and how are they inclined and so on. It depicts the number of seats you can have in the aircraft. Next, we have some performance data of the aircraft. You have a range, you have the required runway for takeoff and landing, and you have the fuel burn at taxi. If this fuel burn is not known, the program will try to estimate it when it does the fuel calculation. But again, if you know the figure, it's better. These first three fields are hard to define because the range of the aircraft is dependent on how heavy it is, how much payload is there versus fuel. For example, if you have a lot of payload, you cannot have a lot of fuel, and then you have a shorter range. Also, if you don't put any payload at all and only load fuel, you will have a longer range. And it's the same for the required takeoff and landing length of the runway. It depends on how heavy the aircraft is and in which condition you're going to land or take off. So these are not important values of these four. The most important is the fuel burn because it's used for the fuel calculation. Here we have some dimensions of the aircraft. These are not important fields. This one is used in the airport info screen, where when you pick a gate, it can tell you which aircraft can park at that gate, and that's based on the gate radius. The last section over here is used solely for the load sheet calculation. These data are based on some default FAA weights of male, female, and child passengers. You can set them individual, or you can simply say if it's the same for all three categories, you can just click same, and they will have the same value. So if you change this one, these will change also. Or you can simply click here to go back to the default weights. It's the same for the luggage. The default values for international luggage is this amount, and it's the same as 20 kilo, and the domestic fuel is the same as 15 kilo. Here, as you can see, as listed here, LB, and these say LB also. All these values are currently in pound, and that's because the data file internally, the program is operating in pound, but going into settings, you can set it up to work in kilo instead. I suggest you don't switch between pound and kilo, because each time you load these data, if I switch to kilo and I load this form and I save them, these values will shift ever so slightly because of rounding and so on. So if I switch between kilo and pounds a lot of time and I save each time, these values will slowly go out of sync. It will take a long time before they start to be inaccurate, but just be aware of it. Set it up in settings how you want it, either in kilo or in pounds, but it defaults to pounds. These Last three values are based on the calculation for the load sheet. When I do the calculation for the load sheet, I would look at how many, how is the max passenger count set, and what is the load factor for the airline in use, and based on that, I will pick a random number of passengers. If you find that that number is too small or too large for your liking, you can simply add a factor. For example, if I do it like this, you are basically adding a 10% factor to that calculated or randomized passenger count. The same for the cargo. If you find in my load sheet that I add too much or too little cargo, you can change it by this load factor, and the same with the fuel calculation. Instead of having to change all the fuel burn values, you can simply change the factor. No matter what you change them to, you can just click default and go back to this one. In many cases, you will not need to change anything. In this case, I based this aircraft on this type. And if I know the specific values for this PMDG aircraft, I should put them in, but otherwise I could just use the values that's already loaded from the database. When you set these values, I suggest you set them according to the load manager that you often get with a third-party aircraft. We are right now creating a Boeing 737-700, but I will in this case use the load manager for the Majestic Q400. If you go in here, you can see the passenger weight, for example. In this case, the aircraft is loaded to the maximum of 76 passengers. So had this been the Q400, I would make sure that this value was set to 76 because that's the number of passengers this aircraft can carry. Next, I would calculate the passenger weight that this load manager is using and set it up according. In this case, it doesn't differ between male, female, and child passengers. So first I would click these two same. So when I set this value, it will be the value it used for all passenger types. Second, we need to calculate the weight of each passenger. So we bring in a calculator. And you can see we have a lot of information here. For example, if I change this one to 0 and press calc, you see these values down here will change. And it's not important which one I look at. We just have to pick one. In this case, it's loaded with all passengers. And if we pick the zero fuel weight, or the zero fuel mass, it's 24,878. And then I remove all passengers. And calculate again. And we subtract 18434. And this is the total weight of the passenger, and that was based on 76. So we divide this value by 76. So this is the weight of each passenger in this load manager. Right now it's set to kilo over here, and Flightplan Visualizer is set up to pounds. So we need to convert this value to pound. You have a conversion you can launch from this form, but this calculator can do it for us. So we simply use the calculator to do it. So this is the passenger weight, and it will simply be this value I'll enter into here, 186,9288. So that's would be how you would do it. You will figure out the passenger weight that your load manager would use, and then you would set it up here, and that would ensure that when the load manager in this program, for example, would suggest 70 passengers, that weight of those 70 passengers that the program calculates would match exactly with the load manager for that aircraft. And up here we only have the raw weight of the passenger. This doesn't calculate any weight for the luggage. So we can simply use the standard values. If you come across a load manager that for each passenger both include the weight of that passenger and the luggage, you would simply enter the weight per passenger up here and simply set these to 0, because it would be including the luggage weight then. The next tab sheet is called substitute types, and that's because the flight plan I bundle with the program have a lot more aircraft types than I have flyable aircraft. For instance, I tend to fly a lot of cargo flights, and the MD-11 freighter, I don't own that as a flyable aircraft. So if we close this one and say we want to make a new one, and say I want to use a 777 freighter. Now when I go to the substitute types, I see all the aircraft types in the software. Based on many of the data from this page, it will find the best matching aircraft, those aircraft that are closest to this one. For example, it will be based on the empty and the max weight. It will be based on the dimension of the aircraft. It will be based on the passenger count. In this case, there's nothing because it's a freighter. It will be based on the usage. For example, if we look here, the first many aircraft are freighters, because a 777 passenger would not be a suitable substitute for a 777 freighter. The first one will always will be selected. Actually, all those with a score of 100 will be selected. A score of 100 means this is a perfect match, and that is because we have just made this aircraft. We have not changed anything. However, if I were to change, if I subtract 200 from this weight, now when I go to substitute, it is not scoring 100 anymore, because it's a different aircraft. It has different data. So obvious, this aircraft is a flyable version of this aircraft type. And the MD-11 freighter that I mentioned before, it's not a perfect match to use the 777 instead. But I would choose to say I want to use the 777 as a substitute for this one. Even though these two 747 score higher, I would not select those, saying I want to use the 777 as a substitute for these two, because I own the PMD 747-400 and -8 freighter, and I would use them over using the 777. So here you can choose which aircraft that this one is a substitute for. And the reason you would want to do that is because when you perform the leg search, you are now in this version able to filter by that, and only include aircraft for which you have an own aircraft that have been marked as a substitute. At least one aircraft type need to be checked here, and you can check as many as you want, no matter how many points they have. Up here, of course, we see the freighters. that have the approximate same size as 777. The further you get down the list, they will be either smaller or larger. Or, when you scroll long and down, you will start to see passenger aircraft, and at the bottom of the list, you will see some very small aircraft, single engine props, for example, and these have the lowest score. The score will always be between 0 and 100. And of course, the higher the number, the better they match. And here you can see some of the data that's used to match. For example, the range of the aircraft is also part of this match score, because if you are flying an aircraft that has a range of 7,000 miles, another one with 2,300 miles is of course a lesser match. Beside picking the substitute types, you can also enter the repaints you have. For example, if we go back and create the 737 again and choose this one, you see we have these one. They have all been calculated with a score of 100, so they're all checked. And we can go in here and add the repaints. And again, it's optional if you want to do that, but if you do it, you will be able to filter on it when you perform a leg search. For example, I can say I have a Ryanair repaint for this aircraft. I can choose if it's I can use this repaint if Ryanair is the carrier or the operator. In this case, I would choose this one, and it will default to this value, and say I don't care if Ryanair is the carrier or the operator of this flight. If it's a Ryanair flight, either as carrier or operator, this is an appropriate repaint to use. I can choose which kind of repaint it is. If it's a special repaint, for example, you have, I think it's Anna that flies with some Star Wars libraries, and that I would say as a special. You can say if it's a current library or an outdated or a retro. And again, it's something you can filter by when you do the leg search. It will always default to being the current. You can put a check mark, and it's by default it's checked if this repaint is installed. For example, we can say this repaint is installed, so I simply hit save, and we can see here it's installed. I can say, for example, add, and say we have a Norwegian also. This one. And perhaps it's not installed. I know I either had this repaint on my disk, but it's not currently installed, or perhaps I've seen it at some websites, so I know if I need it, I can download it and install it. In that case, I would write a note to myself in the comment field where to download it. I could paste in the URL, or in this case, for example, I could say I know Inibuilds have this repaint, and then I can save it. And again, it's optional if you want to do this, but if you do it, you are now able to filter by it when performing the leg search. In this case, it's a commercial airline, and you will often have a library or repaint for each airline. But if you choose a general aviation aircraft, for example, up here I have the A2A Cessna 182. And for that one, I have not put in any repaints. And that because when you add these repaints, you have to pick an airline, because these repaints are repaints for airlines. In this case, I simply put a check in this one, say I want to use this aircraft with all airlines. So that's the way you say that instead of this airline being appropriate for specific airlines, I say it can be used with anyone because it has a generic repaint. If you look at these aircraft I have created, I have added a lot of repaints. For example, this one, I think that's the one I've added the most repaints for of the owned aircraft I have. And if you look here, most of them are not even installed. And I have looked at two places for these airlines. I have looked at Aerosoft's website and see which repaints I can download from there. And I have looked at Builds and to see which repaints they have for this aircraft. In this case, for example, Air Berlin, I have written in the comment field that I can download it for Builds, but I had also listed that this airline ceased operation in 2017. So it's listed here, but it allows me using all these when I perform a leg search. I'll show later, but when I perform a leg search, I can specify that it should only include airlines for which I have a repaint. Or I can even be more specific and see only include those that are currently installed in case I don't want to install this repaint. But it's optional. You can add these data if you want to or not. Likewise, it's the reason I have split the Dash 7 into 3 different aircraft here. This is the repaints for the one without winglets. This is with the BW winglets. And the one I have here. And the reason I split it, for example, if I look at this one, if I'm going to fly this flight, I can see where to install this repaint. In this case, I for this one I've noted that I can download from Builds. For this one I have not noted anything, and that's because I can install them directly from PMDG's operation center. So this is how you create an owned aircraft. I forget to mention this one. Here you simply write the comments you want to have for that aircraft. For an aircraft type, we do not have to pick a type first. For this one, you cannot create it without picking a type. For the aircraft type, you go directly to the screen. Here you can see that you can now enter the IATA code and the ICAO code and the aircraft type name. But instead of an aircraft name for an owned aircraft, you are asked to enter a short name. Right now, I don't use this short name in the software, but I plan to do it sometime in the future. Instead of listing those long names, for example, the top one up here, instead of listing a long name like that or like these, it can be shortened. For example, if this one, if I say I want to make a new type, I can base it on another one if I want to make that one that's similar. And here you see the short name is simply CRJ700. I suggest you keep the short names as short as possible, but still that you know which kind of aircraft it is. In the data file I supply with the software, I have not made an aircraft type for each of these Cessnas. Instead, this single aircraft type is for all single-engine Cessnas. And that means when you import a flight plan, you cannot see by the aircraft type that's detected for that aircraft if it's a Cessna 120 or a Cessna 140, because it's the same type. So if it's important for you to see specific which type it is, you can create those types. So if we start by picking this single engine Cessna type, and I change the name to 182 Skylane. Down here I would shorten to this short name. I should figure out if it has a specific IATA ICAO code and set them, and I could set the production year. All of these data are, I forget which specific Cessna they are set for, but I should look up the detailed information about this specific Cessna 182 and set the data according to that. When we created our own aircraft, this was a drop-down where you could choose one of the values. But now we create a type, it's a multi-line text field. So if this aircraft came with different engine types, for example, if there was one called 65 that had a little stronger engine, you could enter it here, and this would allow you when you created a owned aircraft based on this type, you will have a drop down that would allow you to pick one of these values. Also, you can see the field up here for entering the registration code of the aircraft have now disappeared, because this is an aircraft type. It's not a specific aircraft. You would see down here that the tab sheets, the one for substitution aircraft and the one for repaints, have disappeared. Instead of that, we have one called type detection. And this type detection is used when you import a flight plan. In the flight plan, there is no field for setting the aircraft type with specific data such as IATA code and ICAO code. Instead, those flight plan files only include a name of the aircraft. And that name is decided by the person who make that flight plan. And they could choose to write that name in many, many different ways. And that's the reason that it has so many different ways of detecting that aircraft. Over here you have an explanation of these wildcards I use here. For example, an asterisk is 0 or multiple chars, any char. Whether you write it or not, it will always be prefixed. The lines you enter here will always be prefixed with an asterisk, and they will always be suffixed with an asterisk, meaning anything can come before what you write and anything can come after what you write. A question mark can be used to specify a single char. The asterisk is either 0, 1, or multiple chars, but the question mark is always a single char, but it's any char. You can also write an @ sign. Like the question mark, it means exactly one char, but it means it's a single letter from A to Z. The hash mark is also a wildcard for exactly one single char, but in this case it's a single digit, 0 to 9. And the last one is an exclamation point. And that is a special wildcard for either 0 or 1 white space. And in this case, a white space is defined as a dash, an underscore, a point, or a space. So for example, this one, if you look at the first line, when we look at the name of the aircraft in the flight plan file, it have to include the name Cessna. Then there can be any number of chars, 0 or any char at all. Then there have to be a T. After that T, there either have to be nothing, or a dash, or underscore, or decimal point, or space. Then the number 210. Then again, any chars or none at all. Then the word turbo. And again, after turbo, before Centurion, we can have either 0 chars or a dash or underscore, decimal point, or space. And these are always listed by the longest name first to the shortest name. And that's because when it look at the name of the aircraft from the import file, it will choose the match with the longest line. And the reason for that is best seen if we look at a freight aircraft. So if I choose to see the 747, this one, freighter, and I look at the type detection. For example, the first line, it will say Boeing, then an exclamation point, then 747, then a dash and only a dash. It could be an exclamation point again. And instead of writing 400, I wrote 4 and then 2 hash marks. And that's because the 400 comes in different submodels, and sometimes the creators of these flight plans write that sub number. I don't know if it's a case if there is a 408 model, but had there been a 408 model and that was what the author of the flight plan wrote, then it would be fulfilled with this pattern. And the reason there's 3 exclamation points here is because I have seen example where they have wrote the name like that and then a space and a dash and a space, and then writing it like this, it would be catched. Then there are 2 at signs, and that's because they can be any letters, and that's because I have seen example where they write the engine type. For example, GE for General Electric, or PW for Pratt & Whitney, or RR for Rolls-Royce. And then it have the rest of different kind of freight versions. If we look at this line, for example, had this been the passenger version, it would be written like this. However, for the freight version, it's written like this. And that's the reason I say it will pick the line with the longest match, because the passenger version will miss these 2. So both the passenger version type detection and the freight version type detection will detect this aircraft, but this is the longest of those 2 lines, so it would pick this one. So when you import the file, it would know it's a freighter version instead of choosing the PAX version. We can have a look at the PAX version instead. It's no, here. And you see that this line is the same as the one we saw before, just without the exclamation and the F. If we were back to the Cessna we were creating, sorry, it was here, I should write. For performance reason, you have a test value here. And that test value should be kept as simple as possible, and it should be without wildcards. So for each aircraft in the flight plan you import, it will look through all aircraft types, and it will look through all of the patterns to see to try to detect if it's that aircraft. And I had it like that in the beginning, and it was very slow at detecting aircraft because it takes some processing to test all these patterns. So now it will first look this simple one. Does the text of the aircraft, does that include the name Cessna? If it does not include the word Cessna, it will never look through all these. example, if I want to make this into an aircraft type for the Cessna 182, I would of course remove all of those who are not an 82. And perhaps I would even add a new one and say, if there is a C and then either nothing or a dash or underscore point or space and then 182, I want to detect it. But as you can see, this line does not include the word Cessna. So this type would never be detected because, again, it does not include Cessna as these two. What I can do is I can press this verify button, and it actually tells me this, that this line will never be found by any of the lists. Forget these two lines for now. However, you can see all of these three includes 182, so that would be what I would write instead. So before testing these patterns, I look, does the string, does the name of that aircraft contain 182? If it does not, it cannot be a Cessna 182, and I will never test these. And now you see that first line disappeared. This last line tells us that this pattern is actually used with a higher priority by this type I have in my factory database. So if you were to try to import a flight plan utilizing this Cessna 182, it would not be detected as this type you're trying to create here, because my factory database have a higher priority, so it will be detected as this generic Cessna 1 engine. However, you can change this. You can change the priority. This type priority defaults to -3, and you can choose a value between -5 and -5 and +5. However, you can see if you go to priority 0, it will be highlighted red, and that's because you cannot choose priority 0. Priority 0 is reserved for the file that I supply. However, you can choose a higher number. If you choose priority 3, and we now click verify, still we are told that there is another pattern. This pattern is used by another one, but now we are told that it's used with a lower priority. So if I were to import a flight plan utilizing this type, it would be detected as your type. For example, let's do a 747-400. Let's just choose the passenger version. And we change the name. And we simply inherit this type detection as it is, and we leave it to -3. As you can see, all of these are found with a higher priority. We save the type. We get a warning that this short name is already in use. We just ignore that for now. And if I go into flight plan and I go to reprocess and I say I want to redetect all aircraft types, it would look in all these flight plans, look at the names of those, and it'll try to redetect them. And you see nothing is changed. And the reason nothing is changed is because still my factory 747 is selected. It's the type that it will detect. However, if we change the type detection to +3, and we go back and perform the reprocess again and say detect all. Now you can see aircraft are changed. This is the type from my factory database, and we see now it's being changed to this type we made ourselves. So if you make a type, for example, for the 182 yourself and you want to detect it, you have to make sure it have a higher priority. My suggestion is you keep the priority at -3 unless you have an issue, because if you start to make detection types and you're not careful how you make them, you can end up that a lot of aircraft will be detected as something else than they should be detected as. And if you are in doubt how to set up these detection types, I suggest you ask at the forum how to do it. Right now I have a lot of flight plans that are utilizing this aircraft. So if I say I want to delete it, I'm told you are unable to delete it. And the reason it's you are unable to delete it can either be because you have owned aircraft that based on this type, or as we're told here, that this aircraft is used by these flight plans. So before being able to delete it, we will have to go in and make sure that it's no longer detected as this one, for example, starting to mine and going in and redetect again. Now those same aircraft will be reverted back to the factory. They were using this my version, and now we're changing to the default one. And now it just reload all the flight plans. And now when we go into user aircraft and choose the type, we will be able to delete it. That report we saw before, you can also see here if you press in use. We are told that it's no longer in use, and that's what allows us to use it. You can either use these buttons up here, or you can right click and choose delete. Going back to the owned aircraft, as you saw for each of these aircraft, I have entered all the all the repaints, all the libraries. I have both entered those that I have installed, and I have entered all those I know that is available, whether or not I have installed them. For example, here, none of them are currently installed for this aircraft, but I put a note to myself where I know I can find it if I need to install it. And the reason you might want to do that is because now when you go to the leg search, you can filter by it. The leg search form have changed. For example, these select all and select none buttons used to be down here. I moved them up here, and that's because they have something to do with the filters. So it's more logic that they are up here. Now I can choose down here that I must first you have to select the aircraft up here, but you can say only to include those up here that have an own substitute. For example, if I choose the MD-111, I know my 777 freighter is I have marked that as a substitute for that. So if I put it here, that I must have an own substitute, it would choose that 777. I can choose if I want to exclude those that have not been marked as favorites. When you look at the substitutes, you saw the score. And here I can define a minimum score and say, even though it have been marked as a substitute, only include it if the score is, for example, above 90. it defaults to 0, meaning that all those that have been marked as substitute will be included. Also, I can choose if I, for that aircraft, must have a repaint that matches that airline that's utilized in the flight plan. And that's the reason you might want to include those airlines, or those repaints, why you might want to set up all those repaints. I can choose to exclude those repaints that are not currently installed, or to exclude those that I have marked as generic. And also I can set the minimum type. It defaults to outdated. I've set it to outdated because I don't want to fly retro libraries. So if I perform this search now, so now I know that even though these are flights for an MD-11F, that I have a substitute aircraft for which I own a repaint that matches this one. I can fly this flight. If we go back and perform the search, if I say I don't need to have the repaints and perform the search, it finds 1375 legs or 228 routes. If I say I must have the repaint and do the search, a fewer legs are found and also a fewer number of routes are found, and that's because in the data I have flights for the MD-11F, which I don't have the correct repaint for my 777. But as I mentioned a few times now, it's optional if you want to set up all these substitutes, create all these owned aircraft. The leg search, if you don't choose that you must have an owned, the leg search will work just as it have done before, and it will only look at the aircraft types. It will forget about owned aircraft and the repaint at all. So that's the only changes to this form. One thing I forgot to mention is that with these new user aircraft, I added a lot of new reports that can assist you to find out that substitutes you might not have picked or repaints that you are missing. If we open the user aircraft form, you see here on the owned aircrafts page, you now have this one button called not substituted report. And what it will do is it will look through all your aircraft types that have not been marked, where an owned aircraft have not been marked as a substitute for that aircraft. And down here you have some parameters for that report. For each aircraft type, it will list the between 10 and 20 best matching owned aircraft. It will always include 10 and never more than 20, but there'll only be more than 10 if some of them have a higher score than 80. And these are the default parameters, but you can change them if you want to. Performing this report, you see a section for each aircraft type for which there is non-owned aircraft that are substituting that. For example, the Grand Commander, this is the aircraft type. Here I have the 9 best matching aircraft, so 10 in total. And you see the best matching aircraft based on the data is this King Air 200. And in my optics, it's two different aircraft completely. I would not choose this one as a substitute for this aircraft. and likewise none of the others. You see the match point, the match score drops very quickly. So in this case, there's none I would choose as a substitute. So there's a reason it's listed on this report. Likewise, this freighter version, the one with the best score is this one, and it's not actually a freighter, it's just a repaint of the Airbus 330. So again, I would not choose, but perhaps you can find aircraft that you have simply forgot to pick a substitute for. Perhaps I would consider choosing the 72 to ATR 72 to be a substitute for the 42. If that was what I want to do, I would go into the this one, go to substitute, and I could pick the 42s and simply tick them, save it, and then if I generated the same report, that ATR 42 would not be a part of that report. Instead of going out here and perform this, I can also click a single aircraft in this substitute list. For example, this one. I can see here that the ATR 72 have a match score of 87 for this, if it was to be used as a substitute for this one. But I cannot see if one of my other owned aircraft has a better score. So what I can do is I can right click it and show a reverse match report. So it will, in that case, make a match report where it would take root in this 42 and then find the best matching owned aircraft. And here I can see that this is the aircraft type, the 42. It's listed in the top. Of course, it has a score of 100. This aircraft being edited has the same score as this one. And the reason it's listed as the one being edited is because it could have some unsaved data. So even though it's this aircraft I have loaded, the one being edited could have some other data that mean it would have another score. So it will make a reverse match report by the aircraft types instead of the owned aircraft. So the 600 is the one best matching the 500, then the 300, and so on. If I choose another aircraft, for example, let's choose that 777 freighter, this one. When I go to the repaints, I have a button here called missing repaints. And what it will do is it will look at all these aircraft that have been marked as the 777 being a substitute for those aircraft. It will look through all the active flight plans, and it will look at the airlines used for those flight plans, and then compare to which airline I have set that are existing for this aircraft, installed or not. So it can identify repaints you're missing based on that. For example, you will have flight plans using that airline, but you don't have a repaint for it. For example, in this case, I have set up, if we go back, I have set up the 777 to being an substitute for the A320 freighter, even though it's not visible right now, even though I have set up, I have such an aircraft. And the reason I've done that is because for that Aerosoft 330, I might be missing some repaints that I instead have as a freighter version. And that's why, if I press the correct button, it tells us this aircraft. So we are told for this aircraft type, there are flight plans using Air Hong Kong as a carrier, and I have such an repaint existing for this owned aircraft. And I can see whether or not it's installed. For example, I can see Turkish Airlines, if I have flight plans and for which aircraft they are installed. For example, I have a Turkish airline repaint for the Airbus 318, and it's installed, but that 318 have not been marked as a substitute for this aircraft. However, I can see down here that I actually have one that have been marked. I have a repaint for this aircraft that have both been marked as a substitute and it had been marked as currently being installed. But the reason it's on this list is because I don't have a Turkish airline for this 777 we're looking at. It takes some time to get your head around how to read this report, but basically it can be used to figure out which repaints you might be missing, so which repaint you might want to look for. So that's the report. That's the reports that have been added regarding substitutes and repaints. In this last part of the video, we're going to look at some of the other changes made in this version. In this version, one of the things you can do now is you can tag a flight leg. When you search for a flight leg and you open the leg info box, you can tag a leg to easily find it again. And if you go to the MISC menu, you will see currently I have no menu item below this one. And that's because I have no tagged flights. So what we can do is we have performed a leg search down here. And what I can do is I can go into the randomizer and say pick a random route. And perhaps this one looks interesting. I can open it. And now I have this tag button. And when you press it, nothing appears to happen. But going back to the main menu, we now have this one tagged legs, and we can see this is the flight we tagged, and simply clicking it, we go back to it and see the details. I would use this one often with the randomizer. I would go in here, pick a random flight, say yeah, this one looks interesting, I might fly it, tag it, go back, pick another one, say this one also interesting, tag it. And if I'm going to fly that flight, I can easily access it via the tag menu. You can have 10 items tagged, and they are listed in reverse order. The top one is the last one you tagged, and the bottom one was the first one you tagged. And simply clicking this menu, I open it and can see all the information. For example, when I fly, I often have a flight sheet and a piece of paper where I put in a lot of information about the flight and the airports. For example, I can look up and see the elevation, the transition altitude. I can go in and see which gates I have been marked as my favorites and so on. And often I would kick myself over the leg if I closed this window. because I would have to remember which flight it was in order to navigate to that window again to find that information. But now I can simply tag it and I can find it. So if, for example, I would say this is perhaps my destination airport, and I would consider using, let's say you have bad weather here and here, and I would say, okay, what else do I have a favorite airports? I could double click and I could see how the weather was at that airport and choose if I wanted to use that airport or not. And again, I could easily navigate back to my tagged legs and go back and see all the information. The last menu item here, if you want to, you can click it and it will clear the tags. It asks if you're sure, and if you say yes, that menu item will be gone until the next time you tag a flight. The tag flights are not only visible when you look at the search or the selected airline for which that one was tagged. For example, right now this tag one is a FedEx. If I go down here and choose something else completely, I can still navigate to that tagged flight and see the information about it, even though that flight is not visible on the map anymore. We shortly looked at the leg info form, and here a lot of changes have happened below the surface. Now that you have these owned aircrafts, when you open the form, it will default to show the owned aircraft. For example, in this case, this flight plan is utilizing the MD-11. However, I have a lot of owned aircraft now, and this one with the X marks that this 777 have been marked as a substitute for this MD-11, but I can see all the other owned aircraft I have. So even though I had not marked the 777 as a substitute, this drop down tells me based on the score that if I were to fly this flight in another aircraft, the 777 would be the best matching aircraft instead of this MD-11 that I don't know. I can manually choose one, or I can also press this button. When I press this button, it will automatically choose the 777 because not only because it has the highest score, but also because it's been marked as a substitute. And beside that, it would also pick the correct repaint if I have it installed. This flight is performed in FedEx, and I do have a FedEx. It looks at all the repaints I've told I have, and it knows I have a FedEx, and this X marks that it even installed. I don't have to install it first. Over here, I cannot change anything, but I can see that this aircraft has been marked as a substitute. This repaint is installed. It's not marked as a generic. It have been marked as can use both as FedEx as carrier and operator, and the kind have been set to current. As you remember, this kind, what's the one you can set current, special, outdated, retro, and so on. By default, it will show the type, the aircraft type from the flight plan. But going into settings, I can set it to show the leg info owned instead, and the hint text that appears now tells you what it means when it's checked and when it's unchecked. So if I again choose this tagged one, now you see it will default to my owned aircraft. And you will actually have to scroll to the top yourself to see what the flight plan is saying. The flight plan is saying a MD-11, but the aircraft type we suggest is the 777 because that's the one I own. Also now the report have had a lot of changes. This report shows a lot of this information in a text report, where from you can copy it to the clipboard to paste it into some other software if you need to. But a lot of information will now be taken based on the aircraft selected here. Even though this is an MD-11 flight, we have now chosen via this combo box the 777, so the report will instead show data regarding the 777. The eagle-eyed of you will perhaps spot some differences in this report. For example, now I list the folder that contains the flight plan for which this leg is based. Also, I show the imported name, and that's because if you want to know if, for example, if this flight plans is available in different revision, for example, had this been a version 3, Alpha India Group would label it with V and 3, so we could see which version this is actually is. These information are the same. Down here I list the call sign of that airline, and also I list the load factor for that airline. These data are the same. I've added this one. This is the range of that aircraft from the aircraft type, either from the factory database or a type you have made yourself. And up here you see the distance, great circle distance of the flight, and it's only 2100 nautical miles, and it leaves us this headroom. The flight could be this much longer. These 3 lines are new. We see the structural weight data of the aircraft: empty operating weight, maximum takeoff weight, maximum landing weight, maximum zero fuel weight, maximum payload, maximum fuel load. We see the load data: weight of male, female, and child passengers, weight of international and domestic luggage. As you can see here, right now the program is set up to work in pounds, so these values are shown in pounds. Even though the program is set up to pounds, you can, when you generate the report, you can simply choose. It will default to what you have set in settings, but I can say I want to see it in kilo instead. I'll go back to pound. The label will be updated as well, so you can see the report what it is. These data will be moved from this place at some time. I would suggest you have a look at it, and if you have some suggestion, things that should change or anything, please use the forum. But right now it's just a test to see how it's working. For example, this is a cargo flight. If we instead choose a passenger flight, let's choose Scandinavian and then just choose some random flight here. Another thing I would like to point out is, I don't know if you noticed it, this button has an asterisk, and that's because right now it's set up to you download the meta and TAF information from the internet, and it takes a few seconds. So I will click one of these other flights, and when I do, note that an asterisk will be added here that will be removed shortly after. So now I click, and now the asterisk is removed. And that tells me that now it have gathered these meta and TAF information for the departure and destination airport. So if I press this key while this asterisk is displayed, it will not have been loading the meta and TAF information, so those will not be part of the flight plan. Also, these buttons will be disabled when the meta and TAF data are being loaded. So if I press again, you see they're disabled. Now they're enabled.
and again, and the asterisks have been removed down here. It means so when I click, it have actually got the meta and TAF information to show here. But what I wanted to show is for this aircraft type, it has been defined, or sorry, for this owned aircraft, it has been defined that it has 160 as a max passenger. But the random passenger load, it's not simply 89% of this value, but it's a random number, a normalized random number based on this load factor and this maximum passenger. This random loadout is suggested to be with 149 passengers, of which 73 are male, 71 are female, 5 are children. And the reason it's specified is because if that aircraft have been specified with different weight of those passenger categories, it will be calculated into this weight. And the same, you cannot define it right now, but in a later version you will be able to, and then it will that weight of the luggage of those passengers would be based on if this have been marked as an international or domestic flight. So we see a weight of passengers, we see the weight of the luggage, we see weight of additional cargo, and then we see a total payload weight. And this actual payload for this flight is 80.5% of what have been defined as the maximum payload for this aircraft. The numbers in the parentheses is because different load managers for different aircraft need to have the data in different ways. So, for example, one load manager might need the weight of the passengers and their luggage as one number. So, this number is simply the sum of these two. Likewise, an aircraft manager might not need the weight of the passenger, but it might need the passenger count and then the total weight of both luggage and cargo. For example, flying in the, as I showed, the Majestic Q400, you simply add how many passengers you have and how much cargo you have. So using that that load manager, you would enter the number of passengers, and you would instead enter this number as the cargo weight, because it does not differ between which part of the cargo is luggage and which part of the cargo is additional luggage. Likewise, all the fields I told you about in the aircraft, for example, fuel burn and cruise speed and so on, it's a simple fuel calculation based on the actual great circle distance. It will look at the cruise speed, and from that it will calculate the flight time, and from that it will look at what are the fuel burn at cruise, and simply use that to calculate how much fuel will you burn flying this trip. It will, if you have set a taxi fuel burn, it will use that. And this is based on the taxi out time. So if we look at the departure airports, we can see that, where is it? Here. Estimated taxi out have been set to 8 minutes. So had you set a taxi burn, it would, based on that burn, calculate how much fuel will it burn for 8 minutes of taxi. If you do not specify it, it will try to estimate this value and use that. So you see, this is only the taxi out fuel. This is the trip fuel. right now in this version you cannot specify an alternate, so it cannot calculate alternate fuel, but in a future version that this will change. It will calculate contingency fuel. Again, in this version you cannot specify whole fuel or extra fuel, so these will be 0 now. And it will try to calculate the final reserve fuel. And you see here, over here you have an addition, because some programs will need this information in another way. So you see the contingency and the whole fuel, the extra fuel and final fuel added will be 3,560. And down here you see the sum of all these fuel values. So for this flight we'll need to add 6,170 pounds of fuel. Based on the payload and based on the fuel, it will estimate the weight when we take off. And the takeoff weight will simply be the empty operating weight plus all the payloads plus the block fuel, but we subtract the taxi fuel because we expect to have burned this amount of fuel taxiing to the one-way. And it does a calculation here based on the maximum takeoff weight. We are told that it leaves us a headroom of 39,000 pounds that we could still add and still be below maximum takeoff weight. Likewise, it will try to estimate the landing weight. And the landing weight will be based again on the empty operating weight and the payload, because we expect that we land with all the passengers and the cargo aboard still. However, we will have burned the taxi fuel and the trip fuel. But we do not expect to have burned the alternate consistency whole fuel or extra fuel when we arrive. Those are only burned if we have to hold, if we have some contingency of, for example, extra headwind and so on. So worst case, when we think of weight, worst case, we could land with all this fuel aboard still, only having burned our taxi fuel and our trip fuel. So that is calculated into this estimated landing weight. And we see here that it leaves us, if we have not diverted to another airport and have not hold and so on, when we land, we expect we will be 13,500 pounds below the maximum landing weight as listed up here. We can see here, for example, if I were to fly this flight in a PMDG Boeing, I would forget about the number of passengers, I would forget about the cargo and so on. I would simply enter this value into the FMC and let that randomize the number of passengers and cargo. And we are told here that we have a headroom of 9,150 pounds that we can still add in either fuel or payload or mix of those two. And down here we can actually see that this upper limit is defined by the payload. We can add these 9,150 pounds in payload without exceeding maximum takeoff weight, maximum landing weight, or maximum zero weight. If we are adding fuel, we can add 13,500 and not exceed these values, giving that we are burning enough fuel before we get back. And actually the last value calculated here, it tells us how much fuel we can have in our tanks when we land. We only bring 6,100, but actually based on this weight, we could have 17,150 pounds without exceeding our maximum landing weight. In some cases, it will also show one more value here. It depends on the aircraft and the weight. For example, if we choose a long flight in a 747, so if I press that, reset everything, choose 747. I just select them all and do a search. And let's pick one of the longer flights, perhaps this one. Now this line is a bit different. We are told here how much fuel we need to bring to perform this flight. However, we are told that we cannot land with more than 57,000 pounds of fuel without exceeding our maximum landing weight. That means if you take off and you have an emergency, then before returning to the airfield, in order to not exceed maximum landing weight, we would have to either burn or dump 200,000 pounds of fuel. Of course, in a severe matter, for example, the Miracle and Hudson, an aircraft losing both engines, I'm pretty sure the pilot would disregard being over maximum landing weight. They would return and try to land anyway. But in case it's only a single engine you're losing and you want to return, then you would have to burn and dump this amount of fuel before returning in order to not exceed the maximum landing weight. If we go a bit further down on the list, one new information added to this report. For example, let's look for this airport instead. If I have ranked this airport, for example, this one I have marked as third-party quality, and that's because I own this as a third-party airport. Also, I have marked the traffic density as arid. I have entered a hint text for this aircraft. I can see here it's MK Studios version I have. I can see here the time zone and how that time zone is regarding to the current offsets. So right now it's offset 0, meaning we don't have to add any time to switch, convert between UTC time and local time. For this airport, I have marked some of my gates. This X tells me I have marked these two as my favorites. Here I can see the radius of these gates and I can see the hint text I have entered for these gates. So, for example, this flight flying a 747 freighter, I would choose gate 46. Here, that asterisk I told before, it was still showing when I opened this report. I can see because it only was able to get the META, and the META for this airport, it had not yet got the TAF or the META or TAF for this one. So if I close it and run it again, you will see now we have both META and TAF for both aircraft, so for both airports. So that's the reason you should delay pressing this button until the asterisks disappear if you need that information in the report. If you don't care, then you just press the button. So these are the changes to the leg info report. And as I said, in a future version, these will disappear from the report you generate here. Right now, you can transfer the data to SimBrief. In a future version, I want to change the text of this button. So when you press it, it will launch a screen where it will show these randomized values, and you will be able to change them. If you don't want to use this pax count, this is a freighter version, so no pax count. But if you don't want to use this cargo weight, for example, you want to enter something yourself, you'll be able to. And also, if you have an external fuel planner, you would be able to change those features. And then from that screen, you can launch this report and have these information included as you have entered or changed them, or they have been randomized. And from that screen, you will be able to transfer the data to SimBrief. But that's sometime in the future. If you don't register your own aircraft types, for example, if it's set up like this and you don't have any owned aircraft, you can still see the substitute types. It completely disregards the owned aircraft and only look at the types. So these are the best matches based on those types, and that's based on not only but some of these data. That's how it calculates this match score. And again, a value between 100 and 0, where 100 is a perfect match. In the last version, I implemented a feature to download flight plans. And when you went into this screen, it would automatically suggest both flight plans that you had not installed, or flight plans that was newer. In this version, it will only suggest those that are newer. It will not, for example, this one is not installed and it's not automatically checked. And the reason for that is there can be a reason why it's not installed. For example, this one, this is an airline that have become defunct. They don't exist anymore. So when you see one that's not installed, you should decide yourself if you want to install it or not. So it works like before, but it's just not automatically checked. Down here, you can actually check them all. Say, I want to see all those that have new seasons or new revisions, or those that are new and or not installed, and then select them. Also up here new, you can see now the total number of flight plans and the number of selected flight plans. In the past, I would typically, when I open this screen, I will have to scroll through it and look which check marks were checked, if any at all. Now you can simply look up here and see, okay, 2 are checked, so you would need to look at those 2. This report you can generate here, show defunct lists from Alpha India Group. It now shows all the defunct airlines 2 times. Up here in the top, you now see them sorted by name. And when they're repeated here below again, you see them sorted by ICAO code. So often I would look at the names to look if, for example, with advanced I would look if that have been marked as a defunct. In this case, it has not. So that would be one I would actually download, even though it was not automatically selected. It is not installed, but it is not a defunct airline. And this report is the very same you can open from this window. And again, you see it first sorted by name, then by ICAO code. A user on the forum notified me that he had trouble seeing the leg search form. And if I launch 2 windows here, I drag them in just to mark the width of this form. They're not important. As you can see, this video is recording at standard HD resolution of 1920 by 1080. I run with a 4K screen that is 43 inches, so the video I'm recording is actually only the middle of my desktop. Um, but this user, Bernhard, he was running with a screen that was not bigger than 1960 by 10,000, but he was running with a zoom factor of 125 in order to have a bigger font. And that meant that this screen was too wide to be displayed on the screen. I will not change my settings now. I'm run with 100% settings, and I'm sure it will fuck up the video if I change it. So I will not do that. But I now in settings have this reduced desktop setting. It's disabled by default, but when you enable it, it will right now only affect the leg search window. And you can see these forms I dragged in before. They was aligned with the edges of this form. So now this form is a bit narrow when you choose the settings. Also, there is a split bar between these, so you can drag this one to make it's more narrow or more wide if you have some long names you cannot see. You cannot make the form less wide, but you can make it more wide by dragging it. But it will open in this reduced size when this settings is enabled. So it will mean that people running with 125 resolution will still be able to see what happens. Also new in this version is I've added support for helicopters. By default, it's disabled. The database I supply with the program, it contains a few of the most commonly used helicopters, but you will not see it unless you enable it. And it said here exclude helicopters. We remove that and say OK. So if we, for instance, go into favorite types, we can see we have a helicopter here. If we go into the new form, user one, and say add 139, and we choose this one. A helicopter is treated just like an aircraft. The only difference is the engine type is set to heli. And when you set the engine type to heli, the wingspan is instead changed to a rotor diameter. But all other informations are just like an aircraft, and it's treated just like an aircraft. No changes at all. But at least it allows you to have helicopters. Alpha India Group is starting to make flight plans for helicopters. So it's important we have support for those. If we go into the favorite form, by the way, the filters have been updated. So if we choose engine type equals heli, we have filtered the list to show those helicopters I have included in this version. I have a few I need to fix. I've set the wrong. I haven't set a gate radius for these three, but I'll fix it before I release this version. So we have support for helicopters now. And as I said before, the program defaults to show all weights in pounds, but if you want to, you can switch it to kilo instead. Below the surface, a lot of things have changed in this version. It's not things you'll see. For example, many of the filters have been updated in order to cater for this new user airline. As I showed before, you can filter by engine type being helicopters. That's new. Also, I can choose here, for example, if I list some of these, you can right click and, for example, if I choose all the Airbuses here, and right click. I can uncheck them as being active, and I can say active equals, if I spell correct, active equal false. Now I only see those that are not active, or short T for true. Now I only see those who are active. One uses of that would be to, for example, on my other test machine, I have added many of the aircraft that's supplied with Flight Simulator 2020. I simply prefix these with FS 2020 instead of P3D version 4. And I would, depending on which simulator I want to use, I would deactivate some of them and deactivate the others. For example, let's add this one icon. This is an aircraft from 2020, and it's a default aircraft, so I could call it Microsoft icon A5, and I could set it to not being active. So if I were to search now, do a leg search, and only find those aircraft for P3D, I would choose this one, and then I can select all of the flight plans, all of the user aircrafts, and say I want to toggle the active setting. It would mean that then all of my 2020 that before was inactive are now active, and all of my P3D that was active before is now inactive. And then toggle again back to how they were before. In the previous version also, whenever you needed to save any data, for example, if when I added this aircraft, when I click save, it's going to the disk and saving this file. And the very first thing it does when you click save is it deletes the old file before saving the new one. And if you had a power outage, or the program had a bug between it's deleting that file and saving the new one, it means you would lose all your data. In this version, when you hit save, the very first thing it does is it renames the original file instead of deleting it. Then it saves the new one, and not until it has finished saving the new one, it will delete that rename file. It means if you have a power outage or there's a bug in the program, when it start up the next time and it have to load this file containing your own aircraft, it would see you had that rename file, and then it will simply use that backup file instead of this one it tried to save that it was not able to save. I have not heard of anyone losing data, nor have I experienced any data loss myself, but it adds an extra layer of protection that you're not losing data. Also, this version is logging more information. In case you run into a problem, you can look at the log. For example, here you can see I toggled aircraft. If the program stops after that, it gives me some information what happened before the program ran into that issue. It's not a lot. You see, a lot of lines are added here, and that's because when I started the program, it was converting all the flight plans. So we have a lot in the log this time, but when I start up the program tomorrow, there will only be fewer lines logged, but still more log information have been added. Beside the helicopters, this version comes with a few more aircraft. For example, all of the aircraft bundled with Microsoft 2020. For those I have been able to find IATA and ICAO codes, I have added these aircrafts to the database, even though there's no flight plan utilizing them. And over time, of course, more aircraft will be added all the time. So, sorry. Most of the aircraft information have been updated for this version, and that was because now in this version where you are able to add all these aircraft, I wanted to have these information about the weight, and for those I could find fuel burn figures and so on. Beside the things I've told about now, the About box contains a list of all the changes in this version. A lot of data have been updated. I have still not, before I close this version and make the install, I will need to look how many flight plans are installed with it, so I'll update this information. There are things that have been added that I have not mentioned in this video. There are things that have been fixed I have not mentioned, but you can see it in here if you want to. Thanks.